Here in Section 13, we're going to take on a very important consideration related to global sourcing, and that is entitled ethical sourcing. Much of what we're going to talk about related to ethical sourcing falls under the umbrella of corporate social responsibility, as we see in bullet point 1. To read that out completely, a practice now known as corporate social responsibility must be at the forefront of every international sourcing strategy. And as terms like ethical sourcing and corporate social responsibility would indicate, it's all about a U.S. importer doing the right thing as it relates to its dealings with international suppliers and vendors. What does do the right thing mean? Let's carry on to our second bullet point. In a global context, corporate social responsibility covers a number of key areas, including product compliance, the actual safety of the products that we're importing, labor, the way our international vendors treat their employees, as well as how our vendors' Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers treat their employees. And of course, no conversation on corporate social responsibility would be complete without including environmental considerations, how we treat the environment, air, water, ground, etc. As a quick note, the following slides focus on labor-related issues with overseas factories, product vendors, and service providers. This is an important point to make because oftentimes when we talk about ethical sourcing, we're thinking about the way our vendors treat our employees and the environment. All very fair. However, as we all know, we have many partners in our supply chain, including ocean carriers, airlines, especially freight forwarders, and we have to be working with them as well to make sure that they're doing the right things as it relates to labor relations and the way they treat their employees. It's not just about how employees are treated in a factory. The first thing we're going to talk about is ethical sourcing and labor standards. First bullet, ethical sourcing as it relates to labor focuses on employment practices used by overseas suppliers, suppliers of goods, suppliers of services too. While work conditions and wages are definitely key issues, ethical sourcing initiatives also concentrate on the eradication of the following. And these are high-profile things that we see in business news and really, really important. Human trafficking, number one. Forced labor, making people work, and perhaps paying them, but forcing them to work unreasonable and unsafe lengths of hours. Slave labor, forcing people to work without pay. And one that is especially egregious, child labor. Clearly, as an ethical U.S. importer, we need to be not only thinking about these things, but taking measures, anything we can do to help eradicate their use in the marketplace. There is simply no place for these types of activities, be it a product supplier or a service vendor. We as U.S. importers have a role to play, an active role to play. Continuing on with the subject of labor standards, luckily there are some great guidelines, some great best practices out in the market that we can use. A number of international organizations publish guidelines that importers can use to make sure that international vendors are not violating labor standards. Two of the best, and there's more out there, but two high-profile sources are the United Nations. We've seen the UN come up a bunch of times for different reasons as it relates to international trade. Contracts for the international sale of goods, now in the realm of labor standards. The UN does a nice job. It's a great free resource to use. And then secondly, perhaps one an importer wouldn't think of is the ILO, the International Labor Organization. They do a very nice job. In fact, as a trade tip, in 2016, the ILO published an excellent guide entitled Checkpoints for Companies Eliminating and Preventing Child Labor. That can be found easily on the ILO website and even Googled. Another great source, apart from the ILO and the UN, is here in the United States. And it's called the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. It's actually a law in California. There are certain criteria that must exist in order for it to be applied as a state law, but the guidelines alone, even if a company doesn't fall under the Transparency in Supply Chains Act, these guidelines can be used by importers to create their own best practices. It's just a great resource that's out there and available. To its credit, in 2012, the state of California enacted a law that requires U.S. importers to actively report their efforts to work with vendors that don't engage in forced labor. Full name? It is known as the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, the CTS-CA. And its intent, to quote verbatim, is actually from the consumer perspective, an interesting way to look at things. What consumers should be thinking about when they buy goods. Let's check it out. Its intent is to provide consumers with critical information about the efforts that companies are undertaking to prevent and root out human trafficking in their supply chains. So yes, it is the U.S. importer that has the responsibility to comply with the CTS-CA. But the way the law was written or presented, it's about giving consumers information they need to make judgments about the companies that they buy goods from. That's a very good approach because it gets the whole country involved. The act itself requires large retailers and manufacturers doing business in California to disclose on their websites specific efforts geared towards the eradication of forced labor. It is a very public approach. Companies that fall under this act have to publish what they're doing to eradicate forced labor on their websites. Publicly available. Second bullet, these are the criteria, these are the conditions that exist for a company to fall under the act. In order to be subject to the law, a company must fall under certain criteria. First, identify itself as a retail seller or manufacturer in its California tax returns. Second, satisfy the legal requirements for doing business in California, and have annual gross sales exceeding $100 million. As we can see, some specific criteria there. Not every U.S. importer is going to fall under this criteria. However, as we said a moment ago, because of its public availability, the Transparency Act can be used by importers as its own guideline, borrow from the guidelines to create one's own standards. That's a good approach to take. Even if the law doesn't apply to a specific U.S. importer, they should be using it as a tool. Here's an interesting point. The law does not mandate that companies implement new measures that ensure supply chains are free from forced labor. What it does mandate, second bullet, is that the act requires companies to make the required disclosures on their website. So does a company have to implement new measures to eradicate forced labor? No, they don't. But they do have to make disclosures on their website. Fess up, if you will. As we'll see in upcoming slides, these disclosures fall into 5 categories. And again, U.S. importers that are not subject to the Transparency in Supply Chains Act can still use this methodology to their own benefit. They are verification, audits, certification, internal accountability, and training. Some very good subjects, some good categories there that can be built upon by all U.S. importers. We're going to stop here, and when we pick back up, we're going to go through each of these 5 steps, starting with verification. We'll see you when you come back.